All right. All right, so today's topic is, today's lecture is going to cover an introduction to ASP.NET. This is going to be somewhat different from what we've been doing so far, where we've been doing most of our coding on the client. Right? The client has, obviously, there's also a server-side component where the client would go back to the server for data. And then the server would respond with data, right? It would query perhaps a database or go out to a network and retrieve data and send it back to the client for the client to render. Right? So that was one of the architectures that we said that we were going to cover in this class. Right? And let me just create a new page here, and let me just talk to that here. Right, so the architecture that we've been looking so far is you have here a web browser. So here's a web browser. And the web browser goes to a URL to a server. So here's a server. Up to this point, it has been a node server. And it has downloaded just a plain old index page. Correct? Right, then this index page would download additionally, would go back to the server asking for additional JavaScript, additional CSS, correct? Once it had it locally, right? Once it had it copied locally, all these resources, the JavaScript using Angular, the server to ask for more data, right? The first download was all static content, right? HTML and CSS, right? Subsequent requests from the browser were programmatic, right? They were dynamic, right? As opposed to static, right? So these were all static, right? Whereas this one were all dynamic. Okay, these over here were based on, I go to a URL, and that URL then has, I download a document that document then references other documents, right? Other JavaScript, other CSS, and then I download all the static content and it's copied locally on the hard drive, right, of my local machine, right? Then programmatically, my JavaScript would go back to the server for data, for dynamic content. The server would have these we go to a URL, would say REST user or some object, and these URLs would be mapped in the server, which would then kick off a query to a local database, right, which was MongoDB, Mongo. This would be Node, and it would respond back with JSON. Correct? That has been more or less the architecture that we've been following. Okay, so we're going to change this architecture just a bit, right? So what's going to happen here is that instead of asking for an index page, index.html, we're going to ask for, so here's the web browser. Okay, we're going to ask for content that ends with not static content. We're not going to ask for static content. We're going to ask for things that end with a different extension. Okay? We're not going to ask for plain HTML page. We're going to ask for an ASPX. Or if this were Java, we would be asking for .gsp. If this were PHP, we'd be asking for .php. Okay, and any of these content, right? These are all server-side pages that are meant to be executed on the server, right? And the content that you get back is calculated or computed content that is generated on the server, and then you get and then the response that gets back to the client is plain old HTML, right? As opposed to here, right? When we were downloading executable, right? We were downloading JavaScript that then either went out to data to retrieve data from the server, and then once it got data, it would update the DOM, right, would re-execute and manipulate the DOM, right, inserting new rows, table rows, and whatnot. Whereas over here, the HTML that is coming back from the server is all calculated, it's all computed, right? There's nothing else to do, right? That is the HTML that you get. Right? There's no need to go back to the server for anything. Not that you can't, right? Obviously, you can go back to the server for other things, right? But the architecture that we're following is that this ASPX, right? If this is index.aspx, this index.xpx, right, executes locally, right? It executes on the server. It calculates and generates the HTML here on the server. And what it goes back to the client is pure HTML. Right? Even though you have in your index page, you can have embedded C# or Visual Basic or whatever other code in here, right? What goes back to the client is pure HTML. Okay, the browser never sees code. Make sense? All right. Now here, while you're on the server, since this is running all on the server, right? You have access to server side resources, such as obviously the database, just like here in using Express, right? You had access to the database, right? What was being executed was a function, right? And the basic the basic design was the function was only retrieving data, right? And it was responding just with data. Whereas over here, right, this executable is not just getting data; it's rendering an entire page based on that data, right? And what it goes back to the client is plain old HTML. Right? It does not preclude us from once this HTML gets downloaded locally, it doesn't preclude from this HTML going back to the server and asking for JavaScript or CSS or other things, right? That are client-side resources, right? And obviously they would be downloaded locally, and then they could go back to the server to get more data or whatever, right? But that we know about. We did that already, right? Downloading JavaScript and downloading client-side resources that then go back to the server for data. What we haven't seen is this portion. This is the part that we haven't seen, right? Where we render the content on the server. Make sense? Right? All right, let's do that. Let's focus on that. So these are two different architectures. Here is in this one is very client-side heavy, right? A lot of client-side programming. On this one, you have a lot of server-side programming, and I mean, it doesn't mean that you're going to do either or. You can do a combination of both, and usually it's always a combination of both, right? All right, so let's focus on this second type of architecture, right? Okay. All right, so let's create a couple of experiments in here that are for playing around with ASP.NET. So I'm going to do add. I'm going to create a folder here. I'll call it ASP. And in here, I'm going to create my very first ASP page. We'll use web forms. And I'll call it hello from ASP.NET. By default, usually this checkbox is checked. Okay, and that's fine. You can leave it checked. Well, we're not going to use what it generates. What it does is it generates two files, right? It generates this one ASPX document, and it generates a sister C# document, right? That has exactly the same name, but a different extension, right? It's a .cs file, right? For now, we're not going to be using it, so I'm going to uncheck it and say add, generates for you. So notice that it's a plain old HTML document. Other than the fact that we have this funny looking set of pointy brackets percentage tags at the top. You see that? Okay. Also, there's a couple of the things that are things that we haven't seen. Is this run at attribute, right, which we haven't encountered yet, right? Here we have another run out. We have another run out. Other than that, it's a div, it's a form, it's a body, head. It's mostly a plain old HTML document. Okay. Notice that this funny looking set of pointy brackets and this run at, right? If I run this, what is? Oh, that's some other page. I haven't modified the page. Right now, it's just blank. Right, there's nothing there. But if we look at the source code of what's coming back, you'll notice that none of those funny-looking characters are there anymore. Right, the pointy brackets are not there. The percentages are not there. The run at attributes are not there. Okay, right? Notice that the form is there. The form is there. The div is there. Okay, but there's quite a few other things that were not there in the original document. You see that? Look at that. We didn't have, right, the app net hidden and this input field. We didn't have this input field. We didn't have this JavaScript. Right? We didn't download this JavaScript down here. Okay, those are all rendered by the server, right, when you execute an ASPX page, right? And it's used by the framework to keep track of the state of that page, right? For it to remember, right, if I submit this page later on, so that to be able to identify that, oh, it's this page, right? I'm talking about this particular page, right? Okay. So we saw that the first example on a framework that is inserting, it is injecting content, right? It's removing content, it's injecting content, because this is something that gets compiled on the server, it gets executed on the server, and it generates the content that goes back. All right? All right. So if I say here, let's see, we can say a hello here. We can say h1 hello world, right? And I run this. There it is, hello world, right? And if I look at the source, there's my div and my hello. So as far as I'm concerned, this over here, this div over here maps exactly to this over here. Right, so it looks like whatever I put in here is not being modified or mocked around by the framework, right? But the form, right, and these headers and whatnot, right? Because of this run at says this should be rendered, right? This content, this head tag, right? It is the responsibility of that head tag. It is the server's responsibility to maintain that head tag. Okay, this form over here, it is the server's responsibility to do something with that form. Okay, it's not a plain form. It's not plain vanilla form. It's a form that is maintained by the server. Okay, the server is going to inject things into this form. Okay, like those hidden fields, right? It's going to inject all that thing to be able to, if you start submitting things, the server is going to be able to remember things. All right. So that's the hello world ASP.NET. Nothing very exciting. Let's create another one. Okay. In my in my page, I can embed code. I can embed code. Okay. So for instance, let's put here embedding code. I can do things here. Let's see, it would be page 1, embedding code. Right? I can say, I can have these pointy brackets and %. And for those who have done JSPs, this is very similar to JSPs in Java. Right? Actually, JSPs, based their syntax, right, of pointy brackets % based on ASP.NET. Right. So, for instance, I could do in here. I can declare variables equal 10, var y equal 20, and I can say var z equal x plus y. Right? And then maybe I want to be able to display this content. Right? I want to be able to display this content, so I might say that z is equal to z. Okay? Sense? Right? So what this is going to do is that it's going to take this. In this particular case, it's going to take C# code. Notice at the top we're saying that we are using the C# code, although this could be other things, like it could be VB, right? It can be any of the languages that are supported by the .NET framework. Okay, we're going to be exclusively using C# in this course. And so anything you could possibly do here. Okay. And now this is executing where? It's executing on the server. Yes? So this is not executing on the client. So this is not JavaScript. Right? This is not JavaScript that is executing on the browser. This is C# that is executing on the server. Right? This page executes even before the browser sees anything. These X, Y, Z, this gets executed, resolved, it gets compiled, and everything gets replaced, right, with actual text, actual HTML before it even gets to the client. So the client never sees, right? It never sees these pointy brackets, right? It only sees this Z being replaced with the calculation of 30. Right, so if you run this, okay, so there it is. So Z equals 30. If we look at the source that came back from the client, look at that. Embedding code, there it is. Notice that the initial code that was there, the C# has been removed. It's not there, right? Notice that the replacement, right, the Z variable has been replaced with 30. This is the actual code HTML that comes to us from the server. Okay. Right. So let's see. Right. This does not preclude you from, a mixture of languages, right? You could do the same thing with JavaScript, can't you? You can do exactly the same with JavaScript. So let's do that. Let me change the name instead of C# code and JavaScript. Okay, so here, let's see, we have embedding C# and JavaScript. So we had the same code we had earlier. Had the same code that we had earlier. All right, so we know what that does already, right? Right, let's just make sure. We got the 30, right? There it is. But we can do this simply. Actually, the code looks exactly the same. You can say, here I can say script. Yes. I can copy and paste the same thing. Yes. Right. And again, I could say something like, I don't know, I could do, maybe I could do a break here. So maybe I could do here in H2 from C#. And then I can say from JavaScript. Okay, and I can say here, I can say document.write z is equal to, and then z. Okay, right? If I run this, okay, so I have exactly the same thing, the same exact results, right? But if you look at the source, it's quite different. From C#, we actually got the actual content, right? Which was rendered where? It was rendered at the server. This executed at the server, right? And the only thing we got back is the actual results of the text. Yes? Right? Whereas in JavaScript, we get the script, the actual code, because where is that running? That's not running on the server. This gets downloaded, and who parses that? The client, the browser parses this, right? And it executes on the browser. The browser reads this variable X, Y, and Z, right? And then it executes the document writing to DOM. Make sense? So whereas the server doesn't have access to the DOM, right? The server doesn't have access to a DOM. The server generates the DOM, right, on the server side, right? It generates the HTML document that the client is going to parse. Once the client parses this document, then JavaScript can then manipulate this DOM, right? It can add to the DOM, it can delete from the DOM, right? It can change the DOM programmatically. Make sense? Right? So these are completely two different ways of doing the same thing, right? Okay. Now, okay, well, wait a minute, but you have this, your code is out in the clear, right? It's true. JavaScript gets downloaded, right? These are text files, you know, that are downloaded, and you can publicly see these, the source code that gets downloaded, and whereas the code that gets executed on C# never, right? That was one of the main marketing points that Microsoft was making early on, right, when a lot of people were moving towards client-side programming. Because wait a minute, all your code is out there. People can steal your code, and people can, just everything's out there, right? Whereas if you do it server-side, now obviously, I mean, it depends what you're trying to do, right? So let's keep going, right? Everybody makes sense that one is strictly client-side, one is strictly server-side. Yes. Now, because it's server-side, I have the power here on the server to do everything that I would be able to do on a real, machine. Okay, I have at my disposal the entire, C# library, right, or family of libraries, right? Just like on the client side, I have libraries like jQuery and Angular and all those libraries, yes, that allow me to manipulate the DOM from the client. Here on the server side, I have the entire .NET library at my disposal, right? All the libraries that are available from Microsoft, right, and that I can install and make available here. Yes. Also, there's another thing. On the client side, I have no access to any data, right? I'm all by myself, right? I'm running on the browser. I only have data that the server could possibly give me, right? If I want any data, I have to go back to the server for data. Yes, right? On the client side of JavaScript, I have to make a URL connection, right? To either go to a web API for data, or I need to go to back to the server where I was downloaded from for data. Yes, right? And we saw that how to do that, right? We use in jQuery, we use Ajax, right? In AngularJS, we use $HTTP. Yes, and we go back to the server for data. Whereas over here, right, because I'm running on C#, right? I'm already at the server. Yes, I'm already running at the server. I have access to a database is either running on my local machine, right? Or it's connected to me in a local network, right? Or regardless, I can connect to any database out there, right? Through network connections. Things that perhaps were limited on the client side, I don't have those kinds of limitations here, right? We saw that on the client side in JavaScript, I had some security concerns, right? Right. For instance, depending on the domain where you download the JavaScript, you were not allowed outside of that domain. Remember that, right? There's browsers typically enforce a cross-domain security model where if the JavaScript downloaded from one domain tries to access data from another domain, it is blocked, right? Over here, because I'm running on the server, I don't have those security concerns, right? There is no browser to stop me to do an HTTP connection anywhere I want. Make sense? Right? I have the full-blown power of running on a real machine, right? Desktop machine on a server side technology. Make sense? All right. Right. So it's definitely worth looking at. Let's see. Let's keep going over here. So these pointy brackets percentage, there's often referred to as scriptlets, right? So these over here, this code over here is often referred to as a scriptlet, right? It's just it's a very snippet, right, of a script here of using C# in this case. Okay. This one is a little. Notice that it's a little bit different. It has the same pointy brackets percent, but has an equal sign. You see that equal sign? What this says is that I want you to evaluate whatever expression is in here, evaluate that expression, and then convert that expression into its string representation. Right? Meaning, replace this whole with the string representation of whatever you have in here. Convert it to a string and replace the whole thing. Makes sense? Right? So the general idea here is that anything outside of pointy brackets here, right, of these scriptlets, anything outside of these funny looking pointy brackets and percentage is plain HTML. Okay? So everything else out here, right, like this over here, right, div and whatnot, right, anything out here will go to this client as is, as plain text. Okay? It will not be modified by the server. All right? Actually, what the server will do, it will concatenate all this text as one single long string, and it will stream it just like this long string, and it'll go verbatim to the client, to the browser. Yes? Right? Like this over here, notice when client verbatim, right? That went verbatim just like that to the client, and the client then parsed it and executed. Yes, make sense? But anything that is in the pointy brackets or anything that has a run at, server, okay, that means the server is going to do something, right? Either execute code for you, right, or somehow manipulate the content tag. Okay, everybody okay? All right. So let's do some more examples here. Let's wait. Where am I putting this? An ASP, right? Yeah. Let's add another one. Let's generate some other dynamic content. Let's do dynamic lists. For instance, I might have here, I might want to render, here's a UL, an H1, dynamic lists. So here's a static one. The static one, in one you have maybe 3. List looks like. If I render that, and I see the source, it looks very much like a static list. Okay? Yes? I can do the same thing dynamically. Dynamic list. Static list. Right? I could have UL, same UL, but over here I can do a for loop. I can say for, you do for var I 1 through I less than or equal to 3, I plus plus. Close it, open and close. Okay, and what I could do is I want this li over here, right? I want this li. So I'm going to use that as a template in here. What I'm going to do is right now between the pointy brackets, what language am I in? I'm in C#, yes? Right? Well, I'm going to go back to HTML for a second, meaning I don't want C# anymore. So I close this. I'm back where? I'm back to HTML. Yes? Right now that I'm back to HTML, this is the HTML that I want to render. But this 3, I want to be dynamic, right? I want to say I want to render I, and I is changing every loop. Yes? Correct? And then I want to go back to C# because C# has the closing curly bracket of the outer for loop. Yes? Correct? Right? So here, for loop. Here's the li that is dynamically being rendered. Oops. Okay. If I render that, and I render this again, notice the content. It'll go to the content that I did statically. See that? Right, but one is static, the other one is dynamic. Now, over here, we're just iterating from 1 to 3. But you can imagine that this could be a result from a query in a database, right? And I could be iterating over table rows from a select statement that came back from a database, yes? And I could be iterating and displaying results from a search, yes? Right, and the items would be dynamic. It would be a list of items, and I'd be dynamically iterating over them. You see that? Right, whereas this is static, this one is dynamic. Okay? Dynamic list. That's dynamic list. Let's do other things here. We could do a dynamic table. Or let's do some more for loops. Just a second. We'll do 0, 40. You know, say I want to calculate, I don't know, the factorial. Okay, and maybe I have here H1 factorial, and I want to calculate the factorial. So maybe factorial of var n equal 5. So that's what? That's the var factorial equal 1. To calculate the factorial, how do we do that? We do a for loop of var I equals 1 all the way to I less than n and I plus plus, right? I think n I equal less than or equal to n. And then we say that factorial is the multiplication of factorial times I. It's a multiplication of 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 and whatnot. Yes, iteratively. And then I want to display it, right? We know how to display it already, don't we? Right? We can just say this. We can say that, right? Factorial. We can do that, right? Just like we did earlier. Or, right, we can say response. So response, is an object that is created by the infrastructure, by the .NET infrastructure, and made available to me, okay, so that I can use it within my own code. Okay, what happens is that your code that you're putting in here, is actually only a small snippet of code inside a much larger framework, a much larger piece of code that is being compiled and executed. In that, right, that the framework makes available to you, right, that's where the object response gets instantiated and created and initialized. By the time we reach to your code in here, right, several magical objects are available to you. Okay, one of them being response. All right, response represents the object that is used to write the content back to the client. Right. There's another object that we'll look a little later, which is request. That's another object. Right. That's the object that represents the request that is coming from the client. Right. So very, very much like when we were looking at Express. Remember Express? In Express, each one of the when we mapped a URL to any function that we wanted to execute on the server, remember two things were being passed to us. Remember that? The request and the response. Remember that? And in the request, back then we also said, right, that the request represented, it was an object that represented the request that came from the client, right? It had in there things such as the IP address of the incoming from the browser, right? It had the any cookies that were coming from the browser. It had any query strings, parameters, right? Anything that came from the browser. Same thing here. Okay, all these technologies are based on what is called the client-server architecture, right? Where the client generates a request, which gets sent over to the server. The server receives the request. It processes and generates a response back. Make sense? Right? So most frameworks, right, whether it's in Java, PHP, C#, Node.js, most of these client-server frameworks follow the same pattern, right? You get some object that represents a request, some object that represents a response, and that's how the communication between these two worlds occurs. Make sense? Right? If you think this as a super meta architecture, right? All frameworks follow this same pattern, right? If you know that there's this generic pattern, it should make it a little bit easier to move between frameworks, various interpretations or implementations of the same pattern. Okay, request, response, request, response. Okay, so here we're going to just say fact, right? Or even we can concatenate here and say fact is equal. Okay. Okay. So if we run this, okay, so factorial is indeed 120, and notice that the response, that's, you know, when we said response.write, it's writing into the stream that is going back to the client, to the browser. Right? Notice that the entire code is gone. You don't see any of it, right? And this is totally equivalent to us having done the same thing as this, right? We could have just done this. Fact, right? Fact is equal. Right? That's exactly the equivalent. If we refresh, notice that we get exactly the same extra line item or new line in there. Okay? Any questions? That makes sense? Everybody good? All right. All right, so same as that. Very good. Okay, so just like we have a for loop, definitely we could have tables as well. So let's create a table in here. So we have 50 dynamic tables. So in the dynamic table, we could have maybe have some data. So let's do H1 dynamic tables, where you might have some data as an array. That's where you might have maybe string, course titles, maybe Java, C#, 101. You might have an array. Okay, maybe you might have here double and so this is an array. Sorry, and this is an array of doubles, and these are maybe prices, and you might have this is 120, whatever, right? And then you might render this and say, okay, well, I want to render this in a table. So let me go back to each, right? And very much like you can use the same CSS styling that we were so accustomed in client side. You can do the same thing. We can reuse that as well. So let's here real quick. So let's go to Bootstrap. And let me link to it, Bootstrap. And I'm going to put it in here. And my div, I'm going to say class container, and spell container. And this being a table, we could say class table, and this would be t head, and we have t row and td. This would you could put here maybe td. This would be title and costs, body. We might have a table row. Now the table row in Angular, what would we do? We have some kind of ng repeat. We repeat over the array, right? That is being fed through a controller. We don't have that here. What we're going to do here is that there's going to be our template, right? And in our content, we want to have here we're going to want what? We want the title here. And what else do we want? We want the cost over here, right? So we want the cost or the price over here. And what we want to do is we want to repeat this for every single course title that we have. Yes? Right? So what we want to do is put a for loop around this. Right? We want to say a for loop var I is 0 through I less than the course title's length, right? And I++. close it, and you have a open curly brackets, right? What we want to do is embed this HTML, right, inside of a for loop, right? We want to put this inside of our for loop. What we have to do is now that we want the pointy brackets, what they allow you to do is clearly delimit what is code and what is HTML. Yes, right? Notice that we want to mix and match code and HTML. So we need to be able to say, hey, here's where the code ends, right? And here is where the code begins again. See that? Right? Let's try doing that. Let's reload this. Right now, it rendered 3 rows, right? Because we have 3 titles and 3 prices, yes? But it's always the same, title and price, right? Because we hard-coded it, right? Title and price. We there and use the expressions, right? We can render the expression source titles, right? That's the array. So we can go back to C#, right? And extract the data from the array. That's sub I dot. I'm sorry. That's all there is in here, right? The array, and then we have the prices. The prices is in here. What do we call? Did we call it prices? I forget. Prices I. See that? Everybody good? Right, and maybe we want to put a $sign in front of it. Put a $sign in front of it. And let's refresh. And there it is. Java, C#, Node.js, and whatnot. Again, right now, these are hard-coded arrays. Yes? But eventually, these would be results that are coming from a database query, from a SQL server that responds to a SQL query. Right, and you'll retrieve all the courses and whatnot, and it will be displayed here. Right, and at some point you'll need to iterate and render this. All right, everybody good? Everybody still with me? Okay. Okay, so let's look at now. Let's look at real quick a little bit of forms. So let's create a form here and say amount here. 0, 16, simple form. So notice that this has a form in the outside. You see that? It already declares a form. All right? So the basic mechanism by which we have already seen that the pages are dynamic. Yes? If we go, the page gets dynamically rendered, and we get the results of that page having been dynamically rendered. Make sense? Right? But what we really want to do is we want to establish a conversation with our application, right? We want to page maybe initially dynamically rendered, maybe it's static at first, right? But as we start interacting with the page, maybe we're filling out a form, or clicking a button, or submitting something, or clicking a hyperlink, or something, right? We're interacting with our application, right? The basic mechanism by which the conversation or these events are being handled by the server is through the submission of the page. The page gets resubmitted to the server for processing of the event. Unlike client-side handling, that the first layer of that gets a hold of your event is the client, right? The browser. The browser is handling your events through JavaScript, right? JavaScript declares event handlers. So as you click and push and drag or whatever, jQuery or Angular controllers that are receiving your events. Yes? And then those controllers decide whether they need to go to the server to get more data or change data, right? So they decide to either interact or not with the server. It is the client, the JavaScript. Over here, the only mechanism by which, well, the main mechanism by which can notify that something has happened, that somebody has clicked on something, or somebody is interacting with the user interface, is through the submission of the page, submitting the page back to the server. The server processes your submission, and then it responds with a response. Make sense? Right. So let's look at that. And that is why we have this form out here. And that's why we have that form. And that form is a very special form, especially because it has that run at. This is not a typical form, right? This is a very special form, okay? That does things that a normal form cannot do. Okay, we'll see what the differences are in a second, right? For instance, let's look at this, right? So let's declare here. Let's look up again. Okay. And let's have the containers again here, right? So let's see. We have here the simple form. Okay, so here, right, and I give names to these over here, and I say ID, and I say first name, and then I submit. Okay, this will behave the same way that we know things behave, right? If we okay, and I say Alice, I submit. Notice what happened. The page was resubmitted, and what happened? The same page was refreshed, right? It got reloaded. See that? Typically, the form, you would provide some kind of method, right? And you would provide some kind of action. Excuse me. You would say, some action, and then you would point to where should this form be processed. That is the normal, typical way that you would handle. Here, the model is that this form is going to be processed by itself, by the same page. We'll see in a minute. It will be processed by a sister C# file, right? That can process this data, right? And that what will happen is that the entire page will reload, right? Meaning this is as if I am somehow the page was notified that I clicked this button, right? And somehow the server is responding to me with an updated or a new version of the same page. Okay. Right now it just said Alice, I submitted, and it came back and it re-rendered. Notice that it refreshed. Right? You see that it flashed, right? Or you saw that the page was refreshed here. You see how every time I submit, right? There's a little circle there, right? That it actually goes to the server and the entire page gets re-rendered. Okay, right? Over here. Run that server, notice what's happening here. I'm submitting, right? What's the difference from what we had earlier? I'm sorry? The input. See that? That's something that is not supported by plain HTML. HTML, when you submit a form, right? When you submit a form, it leaves the page, right? It leaves the page and it's supposed to go somewhere else, yes? If you come back to the page, that data is gone, right? The form is brand new. The form is brand new. But what's happening here is that the server is maintaining the state of the page. It is remembering the state of the page. The page was at a particular state, and when it re-renders and reloads, it says, oh, this input field had this value. I am going to feed the data into that value. Okay, if you look at the page source, okay, you'll notice the value is there. It's rendered, even though we didn't put it in there. The data in there, that value, we didn't do that, did we? We didn't do that. Yeah, we never put that in the HTML. We never said that the value is anything. Right? We never said that the value is. Who's generating that value is equal to ASDF? The server is generating that additional attribute, isn't it? Right? It's so that it remembers where it was, right, last time, right? So that when it gets reloaded, it says this was the state of the page, when it was submitted. Right? That is a very powerful mechanism, right, for a page to maintain its own state. HTML, as we know, it's a stateless protocol, right? So what the framework, what ASP.NET framework does is that it adds the ability for the server to maintain the state for you, right? It encodes that state, right, to remember what the state of the application is. It encodes it in a hidden field. There it is. That hidden field is used by the server to remember, right, that this is you, that is talking to you, and that even though different users might be looking at the same page, yes, right, because this page might be looking by thousands of users, right? Thousands of users might navigate to this same page, right? And it wants to maintain a conversation with thousands of people, right? The way that it maintains this conversation is that, somebody submitted that the name is Alice, somebody submitted that the name is Bob, somebody submitted that their name is Charlie, right? And what it did to maintain the conversation, it rendered for you, right, the state back to you, to the client, so that next time when you keep the conversation, it will remember the conversation, okay? Powerful. Server, the mechanism of having to remember things about each user. It would be very, very expensive for the server to have to remember everything, have to remember thousands of conversations. Imagine that. It would need to have a huge amounts of RAM, right, to maintain session information for every individual conversation. Yes. Instead, what it does is that it offloads the state off to the page. The page remembers everything. You see that? Right? It calculates the state. A server. So next time that it comes back, it'll know where it left off. Very, very powerful. Okay. All right. Let's leave it here, and we'll continue our conversation on ASP.NET on Thursday.